fierce northerner's bark was already being drowned out.
"You think you got problems?"
roared a huge man with scar-latticed skin and a scruff of shorn hair.
"If the king don't do for us, the boar'll have our necks on the block before the day's done."
If his appearance hadn't already given it away, the use of that particular nickname for Alvantis would have identified the man. He belonged to one of the criminal fraternities that had given Mounteban his initial leverage in the city. If I remember rightly, he went by the name of Holus Moralis, in honor of all those he'd left in shallow graves outside the walls of Altapasaeda. And once again, his logic was sound. Half of those here would have faced imprisonment at the very least under the old order. A variety of similarly rough-looking characters were bickering to make similar observations, but the voice that actually made it to the surface was of an altogether different tenor. It was a squeal more than a shout, yet its note of sheer desperation was enough to cut through the uproar.
"God, Captain Alvantis, what about those of us innocent of any wrongdoing? Will the king care that we were tricked and cajoled into treachery?"
I recognized Lord Eldanzi, eldest scion of the House Eldanzi. Given how quick he'd been to turn his coat, I felt he had a cheek. Perhaps some of the families had gone along with Mounteban against their will, but I suspected that, for most, the chance to trade profitable subservience for unrestrained wealth had been too good to miss. Well, that more or less covered the three factions Mounteban had persuaded to share power in Altapasaeda. A resounding 3 against, 0 for vote in favor of negotiation. Not for the first time I regretted letting Estrada talk me into taking the stage with her. I supposed she'd meant it as an acknowledgement of my recent efforts in the city's rescue. However, given how quickly our heroic liberation of Altapasaeda had turned sour, I would far rather my part be hurriedly forgotten. I did my best to shrink into the background as Alvantis leaned forward and raised his voice once more to drown the clamour.
"All right, you don't want to surrender, neither do I, yet you all agree you're not willing to fight. Who do you expect to defend Altapasaeda, if not its own people?"
"Isn't that your job?" someone piped up towards the back.
"With what?" Alvantis cried. "A few dozen exhausted guardsmen and amateur soldiers?"
"With what? With those bloody giants is with what?"
That comment brought a steady roar of approval. Good luck to Alvantis explaining the concept of giant pacifism to his unruly audience, for how could anyone who hadn't witnessed it believe that the terrifying creatures we'd brought here could barely even be persuaded to defend themselves? It was only because I'd accidentally stolen a giant and even more accidentally befriended him that I'd come to understand. For Saltlick and his people, violence was something alien and utterly abhorrent.
"The giants won't fight for us,"
Alvantis said simply. A note of defeat was starting to enter his voice, and he was hardly trying to restrain it. After everything he'd been through to save this city, everything he'd sacrificed, I could see that the churlish defeatism he was up against was grating upon his good intentions. Then there was the fact that the very threat he was striving to protect his home from was the king he'd served dutifully all his life. All things considered, it wasn't a good day to be former Guard Captain Lunto Alvantis. It was only about to get worse.
"What about Mounteban?"
someone heckled from towards the centre, and at the mention of that name the atmosphere in the room changed immediately, as though every light had dimmed or the temperature abruptly climbed. There was a pause, uncomfortably long, and then another voice echoed,
"Yeah, where's Mounteban?"
"Mounteban, where is he?"
"We'll talk to Mounteban."
In a moment it had become a chorus, that one name resounding down the length and breadth of the hall. Alvantis stood it for a full 10 seconds before he broke. Then he lashed a foot into the lectern, and it tore loose with a thunderous crack to burst into pieces on the tiles below. Alvantis stood, sides heaving, eyes roving across his suddenly silent audience, as though challenging them to acknowledge his outburst, or to so much as whisper that hated name again.
"This meeting is over,"
he spat, and stormed from the stage. Outside,